the first panel on hate speech and discrimination in media. Let me introduce the chair. He is a member of the Science Board, the founder of Ethics Journalism field, and the General Secretary. Worked for the Financial Times, The Guardian, with extensive experience in running campaigns against hate speech in media, and also the author of the book, Telling the Truth. I'd like to welcome Aidan White.
Good morning. Thank you very much indeed. I'm very excited to be at this conference. It's great. I mean, I think I'm probably in a minority because I'm actually a journalist. My tradition is absolutely in working journalism rather than in academia. But I'm really excited this morning to be able to moderate this discussion, and I'm going to be introducing in a few minutes a couple of really terrific speakers who will be able to talk to us in a context which is really important. The issue we're talking about today is hate speech. Today and tomorrow is hate speech, but we're also talking about media. And therefore, when we talk about hate speech, we have to talk about it in the reality of how people communicate with one another and how they receive information. So I'm really pleased to join you. I have to say the debate, I've been following this debate for something like 30, almost 40 years. As a journalist, I found it incredibly important, but I don't think any more important than it is today. Today, we're in a new historical phase, an important historical phase in terms of communication and information. Yasemin has indicated and talked about the impact of the Black Lives Matter movement. There's no doubt at all that around the world there is a new and fresh consciousness about hatred, about how hatred is generated, and about how we understand it and how we respond to it. And therefore, I think it's really very important that we take what we know now and reflect and discuss and try to sort of to contribute to this global movement, particularly active in Turkey, but to contribute to a new and important debate about consciousness of how hatred operates and so on. The second thing, which I think is important, is in historical terms, is now the growing realization that media and news and information is much more important than ever. We have a fresh understanding that the internet and online means of communication are fantastically liberating, but they don't give to us the streams of reliable and trustworthy and useful information that people need to lead their lives. So I think this new understanding, and that we've seen new figures in the United Kingdom in the recent days, which actually show that although we had thought that everybody turns to the internet to get their news and information, the evidence is that people are trusting the internet much less today as being the primary source of information about what is happening in the world. And so the need for reliable and trustworthy information, and therefore journalism, is really more important than ever. I've been working with the Ethical Journalism Network, as you said, which I launched in 2012, to try to raise the profile of the need for ethics standards, good self-regulation in journalism. And I've been happy to work with journalists in Turkey on this issue as well. At the Ethical Journalism Network, we developed a 5-point test for hate speech. And that has been really very, very important. You can go and you can see that test for hate speech, because it's a very simple way of helping journalists to understand how to identify hate speech. The 5 points are the status of the speaker, the intention of the speech itself, the content of the speech, the nature of the speech, and of course the impact that the speech has. And I'm really pleased that in Turkey there is a vibrant debate about how these issues are being dealt with. And I've been happy to work with the Turkish Coalition for Ethical Journalism, a coalition of academics and journalists inside Turkey who are raising these issues. And they are doing practical work, and they've been involved, and we've been involved in developing hate speech glossaries for both journalists and Turkey and in Cyprus. Well, now I want to sort of very quickly go on to our speakers. And the first speaker this morning, I'm really delighted to introduce in a second. She, like me, I'm a journalist, and I'm keenly interested in all sorts of things, but I'm also really interested in sports. I'm a real football fan, like millions of people in Turkey. I love football. And our first speaker is Elzem Seren Dinç Kırlı, who is also a football fan, a sports scientist, an academic. She has worked at Istanbul University. She's presently doing her PhD at Istanbul Bilgi University. She's been fascinated and studied in detail the relationship between sport and media, but she's been particularly interested in the role of the fan. And that's really, for me, a really important question. This week, actually, football and hate was in the news in a big way with a Turkish link. The actions of what happened in Paris earlier this week, and I'm sure you've all followed it, when a Turkish football team from Istanbul, Başakşehir, they walked off the pitch because they would not tolerate what they perceived as hatred and hate speech. And they were followed by the team from Paris Saint-Germain. And as a result of that, they made a clear and important statement to the world, not just of football, but to the world of sports and beyond, that hatred, everyday hatred, a sort of casual discrimination of language and hatred was intolerable and not acceptable. And it seemed to me to show that, once again, sport could be an inspiration for better understanding and an inspiration perhaps for change. So I really like to welcome Elzem to speak to us and to give us her thoughts on these issues, and particularly the intersection that we see now between the responsibility of media and the role of academics in raising understanding and knowledge of hate speech. So first of all, I'd like to ask Elzem.
Good morning. I'd like to thank Hrant Dink Foundation and the organizers for this conference. I will be presenting my postgraduate dissertation. I am very honored to share my dissertation with you on the occasion of this conference. With your permission, I will go ahead and share my screen right away. This is the outline of my presentation. I will present the purpose of the research, the scope and the limits of the research, the method, the sampling, the identification of the categories, the findings and results and suggestions. This is the outline of my presentation. In the next slide, what's the purpose of the research? I focused on new media. It is easily accessible, it is bidirectional, it is interactive, it is a multimedia environment, multiple users can use it at the same time. These are the advantages, and Twitter is one of those tools. The fans use this microblog platform to share their views. So I specifically focus on Twitter in my research. As to the basis of my research, the basis is law number 6222, dated 2011. The law is there to stop violence in sports. And it also covers hate crimes committed on social media. The new media is under stricter scrutiny these days. So any hate crime taking place in the social media falls within the scope of the law number 6222, legal action taken against the perpetrators. However, we see that the law is not very influential. It's not practically working so well because we still see a large number of hate crimes or hate speech used in the social media, especially Twitter. More interestingly, when you look at the law, the law is numbered 6222, and the fans use this number as a code to use very hateful speech. If they want to curse somebody, they just use this code 6222 to express their hate speech. The purpose of the research is to bring those examples into daylight and identify examples and come to some conclusions. This slide shows you the scope and the limits of my research. Data collected between June 2019 and December 2019 for 7 months. I used some keywords that I will be introducing in a minute. And I searched the content of the posts by Twitter users, the content including 6222. In this slide, I explain the method I used. I used advanced search feature of Twitter. I entered keywords here, and I searched the content, and I conducted a content analysis based on the keywords. This slide is about how I identified the samples.
Özelliklerine göre 4 şekilde bir sınıflandırma var. Cinsel yönelim ve
There are 4 categories: sexual identity, ethnical, religious identity, and health-related or physical appearance-related discrimination or hate. Then I identified the following keywords. Hrant Dink Foundation has the Media Watch on Hate Speech project, and I made use of the data provided by the project in order to come up with the keywords. And most frequently used words came up automatically in terms of hate speech. I chose those words. I made the list up myself. The fans use mostly these words, actually. And they also use the word 6222 with a very negative connotation. When they want to curse, they also use this code 6222. So that's how I identify the categories. I specifically focused on sports groups, individuals, for example, the referees, the technical director, the trainer, the athletes themselves, and the fans. These are the 4 different categories of people involved. And as to the content categories, the first category has to do with exaggeration or twisting the meaning, with or without visual content. So this is the first category. The second one is cursing using F words, insulting. The third one is hostility and war-related content. And the fourth category involves symbolizing. Some contents are accompanied with visuals, some are not. By the way, some contents fall into more than one category. And in that case, I chose the most dominant category. This is a scientific research. Reliability is an important aspect of my scientific research, so the categories had to be clearly identified and described. That's what I did. In a minute, I will show you some graphics. In order to produce the graphics, I recorded all the data, all the contents, and I analyzed them all. And I produced this scale, this category scale, and then I superimposed the content on this scale. This research covered 7 months. In total, I analyzed 2,861 contents. Out of this, 919 involves those keywords and 6222 code. And 1,942 of them includes only 6222 code and no keywords. Let's look at the first group, the contents that involves the keywords. Here is 51% cursing using F words and insulting. This is the most dominant one. Next comes symbolizing, like insulting a natural future, 22%. Then comes exaggeration and twisting the meaning with 20%, and 7% represents hostility category. Let's look at hate speech based on sexual identity and orientation. I'm not sure if you can see the graphic, but in total, I could reach 227 the contents. You can see the keywords in the graph. The colorful boxes represent the target groups. So 66 of the contents use the keyword quote unquote your mother. By the way, I don't feel comfortable to utter the keywords because they are very bad words. Some are too strong, but I have to use them because this is a scientific research presentation. So other keywords include rape or your wife or bisexual. So mostly these contents target the fans or the clubs, the athletes, the media organizations, the referees, trainers, and the federations are also the targets of these contents. The word rape is used for all groups, all categories. This one shows all the colors actually. This column stands for rape. Let's take a look at this. This will make it clearer. Here you see two examples. Look at this one. You see the code 6222 used within the sentence. This hate speech is against one of the athletes. Take a look at the one on the left too. Here, more examples. Here, faggot is this word, and this one is 6222. The word 6222 is used to replace the F word, the verb itself. Here they say rape, your wife. So I go on. Let's take a look at the distribution per category. It's mostly F words, insulting. So they're the red ones, and then symbolizing comes after that in purple, and then hostility. You can see all four categories here. Something attracted my attention. Let me share it with you. Like a woman and like a man. I compare them. In 30 occasions, they use the phrase like a woman. And in 11 contents, in 11 posts, they use the phrase like a man. As to the LGBT, they are unfortunately target of hate speech on many occasions, also in sports, unfortunately. You see the rates here. Efforts, insulting, and exaggeration, attribution, and distortion also exist in these posts. How about hate speech based on ethnicity and national identity? I reached 275 posts. 89 of them includes FETÖ supporter, FETÖ guy, and 50 posts include traitor keyword. You have last 5 minutes. Last 5 minutes. Reminder. Okay. What is next? Arab, Syrian, and Armenian keywords are used in the posts. But this is not surprising, actually. I inserted some examples here, like an Armenian team. This content has visuals in it. You see the categories here: F words, insults, and exaggeration, attribution, distortion, Greek, Armenian. How about this? How about hate speech based on religious identity? I have in total 127 posts, and some of them include godless keyword, and they address the fan groups. Also, media organizations follow the fans in terms of the targeted category of groups. Here, crypto, godless, Jews, and there's an insult against the federation here. There is more here about F words, insulting, and exaggeration, attribution, distortion. Here I have 290 posts that fall under the category of hate speech based on diseases and physical features. Mostly they use the word "you blind." Mostly against the referees, and this is not surprising. These people apparently like calling referees as blind. There was one other example against one of the athletes. Let me move on. And cancer and blind are used in all categories. In 1,942 posts, the code 6222 is used in order to insult or twist the meaning or exaggerate, attribute, and distort. Let's take a look at these examples. Some people think this law is a crime against humanity. The fans are treated as terrorists. Lots of F words, insults. So the number 6222 replaces the F word itself. Here, more examples about hostility and war-related discourse. I'll be wrapping up very soon. How about visual content? Some posts have a visual content, whereas some others don't, but mostly they use visual content. The only thing is, in the posts that include 6222, in most of the cases, they are accompanied by a visual. And this is not surprising either. Mostly they use photographs. This is the results slide. The new media comes with certain advantages. It's easier to communicate. One can freely express their opinions. It's very fast. However, the discourse used in football field is influencing the communication taking place in social media. And another important result is there is a change in the fans' profile. Another result has to do with the masculinity of the language used in media. You can see this in the titles of the news, the text of the news, and the photographs. And in this part, I listed down my suggestions. The first suggestion is the articles, the relevant articles in the law 6222 should be aggravated to strengthen the scrutiny over social media relating hate speech. Because as it is now, it's not very practical. And cybercrimes should be made more visible, especially in order to fight against hate speech and support freedom of expression. We have to make cybercrimes more visible. Many social media users don't know the distinction between the freedom of expression and hate speech. Another suggestion is to make sure members of academia work more with the civil society. I should also say I am very much impressed with the Media Watch on Hate Speech project of Hrant Dink Foundation, and I think this project should be done specifically in the field of sports, and I openly say I'm volunteering to do that. Media literacy should be tackled. There are significant shortcomings in that field, not just in Turkey, I mean globally. We should increase media literacy. Maybe the curriculum in the primary schools should take on board an element that introduces media literacy. Unfortunately, we don't know how to act in social media, what to do when you're insulted in social media. Well, we don't know how to do that. And in terms of the service contracts in the new media platforms, we have to definitely insert some sanctions against hate speech. Thank you very much for your attention. So we say no to hate speech in the field of sports. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And thanks for that. And I think we will have an opportunity, I hope, to be able to have some questions related to the issues that you've raised, in particular, how we can strengthen scrutiny over social media, the question of sanctions and how and can they be applied, the question of cybercrimes becoming more visible. I think that's absolutely key. And I couldn't agree with you more that the focus on sport and the field of sport is really, really important, because sport is a wonderful unifier of communities, but it's also a wonderful point of the intersection of journalism and media and the population at large, and can be enormously influential. And so I agree with that very much. Thank you for that. And we'll come back to you later on when I hope we'll have the opportunity to have some questions. So I'd like now to introduce our next speaker, who's Alexander Royall from the Amman Center for Human Rights Studies. Alexander received a degree in international relations in crisis and security management at Leiden University. He studied the right-wing extremist groups and their role in the United States before and immediately after Donald Trump, the Donald Trump era began, at least as President of the United States. But he's particularly a specialist in the Middle East and North Africa region at Horizon Intelligence. I mean, I think that Donald Trump, Alexander, has a very special place in the world, in that he has been himself a one-man movement for hate speech globally, and has probably done more damage to the cause of dealing with hate speech and the capacity to promote better understanding and good relations globally and so on. But you've been focused on the analyzing media discourse in elections in Jordan and other countries and so on. So we'd be really pleased to hear about what your take is on these issues. Alexander, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and also want to thank the organizers of this event. I want to quickly say that I also got help from Juliette Raymond-Tidres, who is also working for the Amman Human Rights Center, and who is a native French speaker, which was useful for this study, as half of the text were in French. I'll get back to that later on. So the aim of our study has been to identify a moment in time where discriminatory attitudes would be activated and normalized at a higher rate than usual. We hypothesized that the time period right before national elections or referendums in authoritarian regimes would be one of those moments where a narrative of prejudice and discrimination would be potentially most present, and could therefore have a high impact on the level of prejudice in the society in question. We expect that to be so because the incumbent regime would be seeking to get support from the individuals with right-wing authoritarian tendencies, which could be activated by creating a sense of societal insecurity, where an identity is framed to be under threat by other identities. So before getting into some of our results, I will elaborate a bit further on this theory. So first of all, we assume that the level of discrimination depends for a large part on external factors, and that it does not depend on the quality of a society that is inherent to it in one way or another. To explain this, we use the concept of right-wing authoritarianism. This concept proposes that individuals might have different potentials to think and behave in discriminatory ways, but that these potentials are latent and need to be activated to become visible and meaningful. We propose that authoritarian regimes will try to activate these potentials to try and get a legitimacy by designating an external or internal group that threatens this identity, and then the regime then promises to protect. That way it would make itself indispensable to people that identify themselves with that common identity. The consensus among researchers is that the personality trait right-wing authoritarianism strongly predicts whether people are likely to have prejudice towards other groups. Studies have shown that that people that score high on this scale often perceive the world as threatening, a threatening place, and prioritize aspects such as security, cohesion, stability, social order, and conformity. Any group of people that is perceived to be threatening in one of these aspects is then likely to be the target of prejudice. As you might have noticed, the authoritarian regimes and right-wing authoritarian tendencies have quite some things in common. With this in mind, we would say that authoritarian regimes will want to try and convince specifically these individuals that score relatively high on the right-wing authoritarianism scale of an existing threat to their identity in order to have a strong backing from a core base of people. The decision to look at elections and referendums was based on the idea that these events act as opportunities for people to evaluate the regime in power, even if the elections in some cases might be rigged and meaningless, in the sense that the incumbent regime will win the election no matter what. It nevertheless remains an ideal opportunity for the incumbent regime to set the dominant agenda and strengthen its position as the legitimate ruler in the eyes of its subjects. To see whether this indeed was the case, we looked at the media discourse prior to parliamentary elections in Jordan and the constitutional referendum in Algeria. As we are working for a Jordanian organization, and because we knew that the elections were coming up in November, we decided to at least include Jordan, and then we wanted to include another country, at least one more country from the region, so that we could compare the results with one another. So in the end, we decided to include the Algerian referendum that took place on the 1st of November. One consideration was the proximity in time between the election and the referendum, which was just 10 days. And another reason was more practical, as a relatively large proportion of Algeria speaks or reads in French, and my Arabic is not good enough for media analysis, and therefore we had to restrict our data to the English or French language. And this is also where Juliette came in to help me out with the French text. So we wanted to include media outlets that have clear links to the regime. It was difficult to find a media outlet that would be in English or French and had relatively clear links to the regime. Algeria offered an option with Al Mujahid, online news outlet, and with Jordan we chose the Jordan Times, which is owned by the Jordan Press Foundation, which is a majority government-owned foundation. We looked at the opinionated genre within the online news outlets, starting 2 weeks prior to the election in Jordan and 2 weeks prior to the referendum in Algeria for Al Mujahid. And we included all text, regardless of the topic, regardless if they spoke about the referendum or the election. The texts of the Jordan Times were opinions by guest writers or journalists of the media outlet itself. And for Al Mujahid, it were editorials. So we assumed that they were written by the journalists that are working for Al Mujahid. We used critical discourse analysis as proposed by Fairclough to analyze the articles. This methodology is not simply a methodology, but it is also partly a theory. It sees reality as constructed through discourse. Fairclough, however, based on the idea of hegemony from Gramsci, Antonio Gramsci, also argues that some discourse can become sedimented if enough people accept certain ideas and words. This sedimented discourse becomes a reality that again affects the discourse one can use. Briefly stated, you can see discourse as a struggle between different words, meanings, interpretations, all to become like the sedimented hegemon within a certain society. Critical discourse analysis is named critical because it tries to uncover these competing discourses and wants to show how some discourses have won over other discourses. It tries to show the unequal power relations that are involved, as certain discourses can shape the way we think, or at least the boundaries within which we can think for most people. And a discourse can therefore have serious consequences and can benefit those in power. And Fairclough wants to uncover these dynamics of power so that people are aware of power relations and questions of dominance and marginalization, and basically understand how it is happening so that they can then try to challenge the dominant discourse. Fairclough proposes a three-dimensional model that researchers can use when analyzing texts. We followed this model and looked at the discourse practices, social cultural practices, and then the actual text. For the discourse practice analysis, we looked mainly at the conditions in which the texts were produced and consumed by their readers. So here we really focused on the fact that the texts fall under the opinionated genre, and that this means that that the speaker tries to convince the audience that what they are claiming or explaining is indeed correct. We also looked at the reasons why the outlets communicate in the English and the French language, and what this means for how they are written and consumed. For the social cultural practice, we really try to give a brief overview of the recent history of both countries, just to give an idea of what the competing discourses have been throughout this time. And for Algeria, this concerns, for example, the context of the independence war, the struggle for power between different groups, particularly the Islamist groups versus the FLN. And we also, of course, briefly explained how the Hirak movement came into being, the mass protests that had a large impact in 2019, but less so in 2020 due to the pandemic. And then for Jordan, we looked at how the Hashemite monarchy has been in a struggle to remain in power throughout the 20th century. And of course, the influence of the relatively many Palestinian, Iraqi, and Syrian refugees on the political and religious situation in Jordan. So after having given an overview of these conditions, we looked at the actual text to see how identities were constructed. For this, we looked at rhetoric and grammatical features, meaning we looked at modality, classification, figures of speech, topics, and transitivity. I won't have enough time to go too deep into all these concepts, but I'll try to provide an example of each of them and briefly explain what they mean and what it's saying. For example, we could say that the presentation is interesting. This is a simple tense and does not leave much room for discussion, as it presents an opinion as a fact. We could have also said that the presentation might be interesting for some. This shows that the speaker leaves some more room for different interpretations. In the Algerian text, the speaker almost always uses simple tense. Words such as if or possibly are never used throughout text, and this emphasizes that the speaker considers what he or she is saying are facts, and it leaves little room for different meanings and interpretations. it can be interpreted as a sign that the speaker is attempting to close the struggle for discourse by making his or her own discourse dominant, or as evidence that the author does not even consider that to be an alternative interpretation, and thus no struggle for discourse at all. The same can be said about the Jordanian texts. The texts contain a lot of obligational modalities with high affinity, as the authors tend to explain to the reader what must be done in certain situations, such as with COVID-19 in Jordan, Turkish regional politics, and French President Macron's way of handling the terrorist attacks in his country. The instances where the authors did use low affinity modal verbs was when they referred to the actions or statements of, for example, Israel and France, and therefore leaving space open to contest those actions or statements. The authors of the Jordan Times do, however, also include statements and opinions of other parties that they do not seem to agree with, such as the US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and Macron's explanations why he had shut down some mosques and organizations in France. Next, we looked at classification. Classifications refers mainly to how others are portrayed. So we are looking at signal words like they, them, he, and she, compared to the way the self is portrayed. For example, we, us, I, and me. We looked at the vocabulary and adjectives used in relation to these identities. And we noticed that the author of the Algerian text would write about the government and the referendum, that the author would often use positive adjectives and praise the country and the government. For example, translated into English, Algeria, a capital of credibility and confidence expressed by all leaders and civil society actors and tribes. The text also included many cases in which the deictic French pronoun ce, or those in English, was used when referring to others. For example, those who wanted to destroy the country, and those who doubt the capacities of the Algerian people to take their destiny into their hands. This style of speech can create an accusatory tone and emphasize a difference between Algeria and the others. The self is often referenced to as "our" and "we" and described as "the people," regularly followed by the adjective Algerian. At multiple times, the author points out that the date of the referendum was to be held at the anniversary of the beginning of the Independence War, of which the importance is compared with the referendum. For example, it is highly revealing of the will largely shared by all Algerians to reconnect with the values and principles that allowed for emancipation from French colonialism and to overcome adversity. The author portrays the image of an Algeria that is sovereign and united, and claims that there is a new Algeria more than ever united, and seems to be assured that many will vote yes for the referendum. As the speaker states that the Algerian people are used to respond to their call of duty, the Jordan Times editorials differ from their Algerian counterpart. Although there are plenty of discursive practices that produce binary identities, such as the Arab world versus the West, Islam versus other religions, Palestine versus Israel, moderate Muslims versus extremist Muslims, and so on, they also combine different identities that contrast from the traditional binary identities, such as Arab Americans, Palestinian Arabs with Israeli citizenship, French Muslims, and, for example, European Muslims. This shows that while the authors continue to portray people in groups, the groups are not as homogeneous as usually by acknowledging the different subgroups. There is nevertheless a strong focus on Israel, and some of the recurring adjectives that were found in connection with Israel are incremental genocide, ethnic cleansing, apartheid, institutional racism, and siege. The use of metaphors and figures of speech was also a common feature of both texts. Al-Mujahid often had metaphors of a train that was moving forward very fast towards a certain direction. For example, getting a stronger and more secure Algeria back on track. And the train of radical change has started. Just to say, there are only 3 minutes left, so there's no stress about the time. Metaphors like this are strong as it implies that Algeria is going forward at a high speed and that there's no real way back. The Jordanian text contain less metaphors overall, but strong ones are still used to refer to the case. So overall, we had a few things that stood out for us as we analyzed the texts. While nearly all of the Algerian texts refer to the referendum, there's not even a single mention of the Jordanian election in the Jordan Times texts. This could indicate that Al-Mujahid wants to shape the discourse on this issue, while the Jordan Times actually doesn't seem that bothered by it. The Al-Mujahid texts make a stronger use of othering than the Jordan Times texts. And Al-Mujahid distinguishes between Algeria, which includes the government and their version of the Hirak, and the others, which are vaguely defined. This vagueness makes it easier to include anyone into that group, even the actual representatives of the Hirak movement. And the Jordan Times is more nuanced and creates a sense of world unity, or at least a Muslim unity, where everyone agrees with their Sunni moderate interpretation of Islam. However, by doing so, it also engages in othering, as it creates a dichotomy between the Muslim world versus Israel and the West, specifically France. The Algerian newspaper focuses on internal threats, while the Jordanian newspaper focuses on external threats. But by othering, they both create a situation in which discrimination and prejudice is possible, as the good in-group versus the bad out-group has the potential of activating latent right-wing authoritarian potentials. And that was my presentation. Thank you for listening.